Welcome to this explainer. Have you ever actually wondered how monumental, centuries-old religious traditions evolve? Because it's a super common misconception that religions just exist in total isolation, like they're perfectly preserved in a vacuum. But history? Well, history tells a radically different story. Like literally all cultural traditions, religion adapts. It adapts to existing situations to meet the very real social and spiritual needs of everyday people. So today, we're exploring a deeply fascinating period in Indian history where colliding beliefs didn't just clash with each other, they fundamentally transformed each other.
Okay, let's dive right into this by defining our central theme here, cultural syncretism. Simply put, it's the amalgamation, or, the blending, of different religions and cultures. It's this messy, beautiful historical process where completely distinct traditions interact, absorb elements from one another, and ultimately create something entirely new.
To unpack this massive historical shift, we'll follow a quick roadmap. First, the origins of cultural syncretism, followed by the conflict in the South. Then, we'll look at the impact of Sufism, the spread to the North, key proponents and voices, and finally, wrap up with the movement's lasting impact.
All right, let's get started with Section 1, Origins of Cultural Syncretism. To really grasp this, we've got to look way back. The Vedic religion, which arrived with Aryan-speaking peoples in India, definitely didn't stay isolated. It immediately started absorbing elements from the pre-existing Indus civilization, things like mother goddess worship from Harappa, for instance. Looking at this timeline kind of puts those macro-historical shifts into perspective. In the mid-first millennium BCE, heterodox religions like Buddhism and Jainism emerged in the Indo-Gangetic Valley, really challenging orthodox Vedic practices. Then, fast forward to the 7th through 10th century CE, and we see this massive religious renaissance, the Bhakti movement, flourishing down in South India. And finally, by the 15th century, an absolute outburst of devotional poetry sweeps right across the north.
Moving on to Section 2, Conflict in the South.
Now, to understand the massive cultural reboot that was brewing in that middle era, we have to set the scene in southern India. Society was essentially transforming from a tribal structure into a much more rigid monarchical system. And these new kings, well, they needed to patronize religions to legitimize their rule, which sparked this fierce battle for royal favor. On one side, you've got the heterodox sects, Buddhism and Jainism. Supported mostly by the merchant class in the state, these groups were known for ethical, fatalistic, and atheistic traditions. But on the other side were the orthodox and emerging sects. Rooted in the landholding castes, these folks were theistic, deeply devotional, and they really celebrated life through vibrant festivals and rituals. So this wasn't just some polite philosophical debate, right? It was an intense, real-world struggle for societal control, which honestly sometimes even boiled over into violent persecution.
But out of all that intense conflict, an incredible solution emerged for the common people: Bhakti. Bhakti quite literally means devotional surrender to a supreme god for attaining salvation. While elite scholars like Adi Shankara were out there providing Hinduism with highly intellectual, complex doctrines to counter Buddhism and Jainism, Bhakti just bypassed the intellect altogether. Thanks to these amazing poet-saints writing moving verses in everyday language, it provided a direct, totally accessible path of pure devotion for regular, everyday people.
And honestly, here is the fascinating historical irony of the whole thing. While the Bhakti movement, backed by royal patronage, ultimately led to the effective defeat and downfall of Buddhism and Jainism in the Tamil country, the Orthodox religion definitely did not walk away unchanged. Actually, Vedic Hinduism was permanently transformed. It ended up absorbing core ideas directly from its defeated rivals, most notably the concept of renunciation, a high value placed on vegetarianism, and the strict prohibition of killing animals. It's like they won the battle but adopted the other side's playbook.
Let's transition now to Section 3, the impact of Sufism.
So the advent of Islam with the Turkish conquest posed a brand new dynamic for the subcontinent. By the end of the 14th century, a huge section of the Indian population had embraced Islam, really drawn to its universal message of equality. But, running perfectly in parallel with the Hindu Bhakti movement, Islam was experiencing its very own mystical evolution. Now, what's really interesting about this is this beautiful Sufi quote that captures it perfectly. God is Mashuk, meaning the beloved, and Sufis are ashiks, the lovers. Sufism represented this beautiful inward esoteric side of Islam. Sufi saints viewed God as a supreme beauty, teaching that you just had to take absolute delight in his thought and concentrate entirely on him.
The social impact of this was, frankly, absolutely profound.
Sufism didn't just stay quietly hidden away inside mosques, it took deep root in both rural villages and bustling urban areas. These saints completely transcended rigid religious distinctions and boldly rebelled against orthodoxy and hypocrisy. At a time when brutal political power struggles were literally tearing society apart, Sufis stepped up to remind everyday people of their moral obligations. And, perhaps most importantly, their focus on a shared, universal spiritual bliss helped blunt the sharp edge of Hindu-Muslim conflicts, forging genuine, lasting feelings of solidarity and brotherhood across the board.
This brings us to Section 4, Spread to the North.
So, by the time we hit the 15th century, North Indian society was in desperate need of a spiritual revolution. It had unfortunately degenerated into a deeply caste-ridden community, heavily bogged down by segregation, polytheism, and incredibly rigid idolatry. Basically, the stage was perfectly set for a new wave of religious-minded saints. Look at how the Northern Bhakti movement brilliantly dismantled the monopoly of the Orthodox elite. First, they preached strict monotheism. They taught that salvation came through simple, deep devotion and self-surrender, not through some complex, expensive ceremonies. They actively advocated for universal brotherhood, while harshly criticizing idol worship, empty rituals, and exclusive pilgrimages. Crucially, they argued that all living beings were God's children, completely denouncing the caste system based on birth. And, to make absolutely sure everyone got the message, they stopped using elite sacred languages and started composing their moving poetry in the everyday language of the common people. A real game changer.
All right, let's explore Section 5, Key Proponents and Voices.
So, who actually led this incredible charge? Well, it wasn't kings or wealthy merchants, it was the marginalized, the working class, and the incredibly brave. Take Kabir, for instance. He's arguably the most important cultural figure of medieval India, and yet he was likely just a working-class weaver. It's amazing to think about. He was a true religious radical and a seeker of God who just relentlessly ridiculed ostentatiousness and ritualism. What makes Kabir so historically fascinating is that he denounced the narrow sectarianism of both Hinduism and Islam with exactly the same zest, dedicating his entire life to breaking down the massive barrier separating the two communities.
Next up is Ravidas. Born into a family of tanners, which was a highly marginalized group in the social hierarchy back then, Ravidas became an incredibly revered teacher. He used his devotional songs to fiercely speak out against the strict social divisions of both caste and gender. His relentless pursuit of personal spiritual freedom made such a massive cultural impact that his songs were ultimately included in the revered Sikh scriptures. Just incredible.
And speaking of the Sikh faith, here we have Guru Nanak. Of all the historical saints we're discussing today, Guru Nanak arguably had the biggest lasting institutional influence. He founded the Sikh religion, a strictly monotheistic faith that heavily emphasized the oneness of God and adherence to strict moral standards. His teachings didn't just inspire a few individuals, they resulted in the creation of a powerful, resilient community that expanded swiftly across the Punjab region.
We also have incredible female voices driving this movement, like Mirabai. Born a Rajput princess and married into literal royalty, Mirabai took a radically different path in life. She left the wealth and the strict confines of her palace to publicly preach the worship of God through pure love. She strongly stressed that divine grace should never, ever be restricted by your birth, your poverty, your age, or your sex. Her bhajans, her devotional songs, carried this radical message into almost every Hindu household. And amazingly, they're still sung with immense fervor today.
But the movement definitely didn't stop there. This was a truly exciting pan-Indian uprising. You had Chaitanya in Bengal popularizing ecstatic group dancing, Namadeva, the son of a tailor, traveling as far as the Punjab, Ramananda, who dared to preach his doctrine of equality in vernacular Hindi, Surdas, the blind bard of Agra writing incredibly moving poetry, and Tukaram, a former trader spreading the message of brotherhood in Maharashtra. I mean, they came from literally all walks of life to completely democratize spirituality for everyone.
Which brings us to our final chapter, Section 6, the movement's lasting impact.
So the crucial point is, what did all of this cultural blending, this poetry, and this protest actually leave behind? How did it permanently alter the fabric of Indian society? Well, the tangible results are pretty staggering. First and foremost, salvation, which was previously restricted to just the upper tiers of the social hierarchy, became available to absolutely everyone. This offered an inclusive path for women and lower castes. It also triggered a massive explosion of literature and poetry, firmly cementing the importance of regional, everyday languages over sacred, exclusive texts. It gave birth to the Sikh religion, which continues as a major world faith today. And the everyday cultural practices we see in India right now, the community singing, the vibrant festivals, the inclusive pilgrimages, these all survived and flourished largely because of the Bhakti and Sufi movements.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought. We've seen how medieval society, despite having deep political conflicts, rigid social hierarchies, and intense religious strife, managed to produce a grassroots movement based entirely on love, universal brotherhood, and mutual respect. It proves that cultures don't have to exist in isolation. They can actually blend to bring out the very best in humanity. So how can those same syncretic ideals from the 15th century inspire universal brotherhood in our world today? It's definitely something powerful to reflect on. Thanks for joining me on this journey, and keep exploring.